Tua Tagovailoa with what appears to be a concussion and has been taken to the hospital. So unfortunate way to end the first half there. But the game does go on, and that means bets are still rolling. So we're going to look at how we adjust with that. So let me bring up my screen here, and I'll show you guys how we're doing that adjustment. First of all, just in general right now, we have a close game. And so if I highlight these splits here, these teams are expected to play a little slower in the second half in general, but the fact that the game is close should negate that. So we're looking at a pretty neutral pace situation here. So I'm not really looking at any over or under total bets for the second half, but we still can look at the player props. So I consulted with our director of predictive analytics, Sean Kerner, on how to adjust for that because he sets our baseline projections, and then my in-game model will modify those based off of expected splits of pass rush, total plays, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And after consulting with Sean, we kind of came up with the fact that we think should Teddy Bridgewater have played the whole game, we're projecting him around 226 passing yards. So we scaled all the rest of the receivers' receiving yards accordingly. And that's where we stand now. So Bridgewater already has 71 passing yards because he came in during that 2-minute warning when you're trying to move the ball down the field. They were trailing. And now Miami is going to start with the ball in the second half. So we have a live projection for Teddy Bridgewater of 203.5 yards. And believe it or not, some sites have put up a prop for it for Teddy Bridgewater's passing yards, and we see 205.5. So 203.5 versus 205.5. Let me go put that over here. We're right on. We're right on. Our projection is right on with what the books are posting. So we're basically at 50-50, and that's pretty incredible. So no betting there. If I did have a lean, I would have to lean possibly to the over, even though the model says under here, just because we saw Miami was passing with Bridgewater there. Obviously, it was close to the 2-minute drill, but they seem to be moving the ball pretty well. But I'm not going to make any bets there. I think it's probably a pretty dicey situation. Let's look at Joe Burrow's passing yards while we're at it. The live market is showing 261.5, and we're showing 258.5. Now, Miami is going to start with the ball, so definitely I think 261 is probably a bit on the high side. I would look to potentially take the under here. And again, the reason for potentially taking the under, yeah, Cincinnati is ahead by 2, but not only are they ahead by 2, they're also like 64% to win ballpark. I'm using the live market. I'm just looking at various books money line and then removing the vig, and that is giving us a live win probability. So Cincinnati right now 64% to win. So that means their pass expectation is about 6% lower in the second half than their baseline pass expectation coming into the game. So definitely think they'll be passing a little bit less as the game goes on if they maintain this lead. Plus, Cincinnati is not starting with the ball. So I do have a lean here on Joe Burrow's under on his passing yards, but I do want to actually look maybe at his receivers as well, because maybe there's one receiver that is standing out where the under is going to be really prevalent and all the other guys are going to be in line with things. So let's take a look at receiving yardage props. Specifically, let's start with Cincinnati. So right now I'm seeing a live line for Joe Mixon at 22.5 yards. And then that right there, the result looks about 50-50. If we come down to Jamar Chase, I'm looking at 40.5. If we come to T. Higgins, who had that nice long touchdown grab, he's at 91.5. Not 911.5, but 91.5. Kyler Boyd, his live yardage prop is 16.5. Hasn't gotten too involved today. And then let's come down here to the tight ends. Hayden Hurst has had a couple nice grabs so far. 33.5 is the live line on him. So let's see, where are we showing any value potentially on these Cincinnati receivers? It looks like the biggest value here would be on T. Higgins over, which is kind of interesting knowing that we're leaning towards, Burrow under. So definitely a little bit of a weird situation there where we're looking at that. But I mean, I'm watching live lines right now and they're constantly adjusting. Tyler Boyd still at 16.5. T. Higgins has stayed at 91.5. Jamar Chase 48.5. They all look pretty in line, which is why I think it's weird that Joe Burrow's line is showing over or showing value on the under, but then everybody here is showing value slightly towards the over. So kind of interesting there. Let me just take a look and see if, Joe Burrow's passing yardage prop has moved, and it's actually moved up to 262.5. So we are really showing some value on the under here. As it moves up to 262.5, I think instead of a lean on the under, I'm actually just going to go with the under here. We also have Teddy Bridgewater in, right? He's the backup now. So we are actually going to bet 262.5 under passing yards for Joe Burrow. While Teddy Bridgewater is a top 3 backup, he still is the backup. And now he has to switch. We're switching handedness. Teddy Bridgewater and Tua Tagovailoa opposite-handed throwing, so there has to be some adjustments there. So it could be a little bit more difficult for Miami here, which should favor Cincinnati's win probability a little bit more, meaning a little bit more rushing. Maybe they get a bit more conservative. So we are going to go with a bet on the under for 262.5 yards on Joe Burrow. Part of that also is our projection is showing 258.5, and he's not starting with the ball, so we expect that to climb down if Miami were to move the ball even a little bit on this drive. So that's why we've made that an under. Now let's look at the rushing game, because I'm very curious in the rushing game. It's going to be hard to project Miami because of the injury to Tua, but I think it will be easier to project Cincinnati. So let's go to Cincinnati's rushing game first, and we will go with Joe Mixon, the live projection, 67.5 yards. And we're showing, I did that in the receiving. That's why I was so confused. We are showing some value on the over here for Joe Mixon's rushing yards. Now, they aren't going to start with the ball, but I do think this is a very interesting spot. Let me continue on here. Don't see anything for P. Ryan's rushing yards. So just Joe Mixon. Now while we're here, let's look at Raheem Mostert. We've got 44.5. And with Chase Edmonds, who I was leaning under, if you listen to if you listen to Green Dot Daily this morning, I was leaning Chase Edmonds under. So now 17.5, we're showing a little bit of value to the over on his rushing yards. So that's kind of interesting. I think if we're looking at anything, Raheem Mostert's under 44.5 rushing yards looks really interesting. You think Miami is going to have to be throwing the ball a little bit more. Let's see. We've got Miami projected to throw only about 1% more than their expectation. So the fact that we're actually showing value on Mostert's under, I think, is very interesting. He has 22 yards right now. And let me just make sure I'm not missing that projection. No, we got him 22 yards right there. So maybe this is potentially Miami is just going to be rushing more. Maybe they don't want to put it in Teddy Bridgewater's hands as much, which is why books are setting the line a little bit higher. So again, probably a situation we want to avoid. So I think the best bet is probably at this point, if we're looking at the rushing game, would be Mixon's over. But we do have a question about Cincinnati second half -2.5. I'm not really, so our live projections here, our live bets are mostly focused on player props and then the totals. Getting into the spread becomes a little bit tough, especially when we have a situation with an injury. One thing I will say is I was leaning towards, I should say even more than leaning, I was definitely on Cincinnati at -3.5 earlier today because our luck rankings that we're coming out with has shown that Miami has been the luckiest team in the NFL when it comes to win-loss record relative to expected scoring. Miami's had a lot of long touchdowns, which don't tend to have a lot of high touchdown expectation. We expect that long touchdown regression to hit them. So if the markets are accounting, or if bettors are looking and seeing how much Miami's been scoring, they're probably overvaluing. And at the same time, Cincinnati has been the fourth most unlucky. So there could be some value at -2.5. Obviously, the single field goal would do it, but not so sure here on this one. So we're getting close to what I think is the end of halftime here. So let's go with our original bet. And then also, I am willing to add in Joe Mixon's over on 67.5 rushing yards, simply because I think this is a situation that certainly favors Cincinnati. So I'd rather, if we like Cincinnati -2.5, and I don't necessarily do, I'd rather than just stick with Joe Mixon's over on his rushing yards. I think that's probably the way to go here. So that is going to do it for Bet What Happens Live. A pretty tough situation, unfortunately. We wish, obviously, Tua all the best, and hope you all enjoyed the second half. Once again, to recap, Joe Burrow under 262.5 pass yards, kind of correlated with Joe Mixon going over 67.5 rushing yards. That'll do it for Bet What Happens Live. Enjoy the rest of the game, everyone.